We're using the hashtag #TransformURE. So if you'd like to tweet about this conversation, it's another way we can engage people who can't be with us in what we're talking about. So please do that. And we'll put that in the chat for you as well. And we'd like you to post any questions you have or comments using the chat function. If possible, if you've got questions, could you keep them quite brief? So it's great if you want to put comments in, but if you also want to post a question, if you could put that separately and make it nice and short so that Olivia can pick it up. And if it's directed to a particular panel member, please let us know so we can make sure we get your question to the right person. But I'm going to hand over to Olivia. Thanks so much for doing this today, Olivia. Over to you.
Thanks, Annette, and thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Catherine, for inviting me to share this fantastic session. It's one that's very close to my personal heart and my day job. For those of you that don't know me, I'm based at University College London, and I'm part of a 4-year funded, Research England funded project called Capabilities in Academic Policy Engagement, or CAPE for short. A little bit about CAPE. So CAPE's a consortium project made up of 5 English universities, 3 policy partners and an independent evaluation team from the Transforming Evidence Hub. The questions that CAPE's really keen to explore, and why I'm so pleased to be engaging with our panelists today, include kind of understanding what works and what doesn't in academic policy engagement, what are the systems and structures that are needed to support it, and also how to embed equality, diversity, inclusion in those engagements. And I would just like to reflect, as a neurodivergent person, I'm personally interested in how we can attend to kind of the performative agendas that are often so highly celebrated when we look at sort of top tips and systems and structures and how to do engagement, and they're almost sort of seen as part of sort of driving excellence. So I'm very interested to see from our panel today what they're going to be speaking about and what kind of their ideas are for the future that might get us beyond some of the instrumental performative aspects that we're told so much about in the research policy system. So given the focus today, I'm really pleased to be chairing, and it's definitely the questions that the panelists are going to be covering, such as, you know, what is the evidence intermediary system we'd actually like to see, rather than what is the one that we're trying to work within. You know, what do we hold dear and what do we want to throw out, and what do we think is needed to make that system more effective? All very, very meaty topics. So tonight you'll be hearing from, we've got 3 fantastic speakers, and obviously are bringing their knowledge of an international system, which is great. And I shall certainly be in listening mode for CAPE, which is focused much closer in the English system. But today we're going to be hearing from Rose Oronje, who's Director of Public Policy and Knowledge Translation from the Africa Institute for Development Research, Kenya, Itzhak Yanovitzky, and apologies for the pronunciations of names, Professor of Communications at Rutgers in the US, and John Lavis, who's co-lead of the Global Evidence Commission in Canada. So as I say, sorry for any mispronunciations. Hopefully the speakers can get the opportunity to pronounce them right. We're going to have 10 minutes of presentations from each, and then we're going to have the opportunity to launch into questions. As Annette said, please do pose questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully get to run through as many as possible. So without further ado, over to you, Rose. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and I'm honored to be in this panel today and to speak to the issue of intermediary organizations and how we can do better. You know, how can we make the future of the work of evidence intermediation better? So I'll speak, of course, drawing very much from my experience at AFIDEP, or the African Institute for Development Policy, which is a regional research and policy institute that was set up deliberately to focus on bridging the gap between evidence generation and use. And that has meant that we work at the intersection of users of evidence. Largely for us, the focus is government agencies, parliaments, and then with the producers of different types of evidence. So those will be research institutions, but also we know that government agencies generate a lot of routine data, which is useful and critical for decision making. And also, of course, there are other data and evidence generators. So we focus on bridging that gap. And so just to get to the topic, so I don't go on so much about affidavits, just to focus on the topic of conversation today, I will speak to 4 things. And the first one that I want to speak to is the future of evidence intermediary organizations. Like, how does better look like? I'll just say a couple of things of where I think we should be going as intermediary organizations if we are going to really support and nurture a culture of evidence use in decision making. And one of them is the value or the importance of growing the field of evidence-informed decision making. Yes, there is quite some scholarship around this, but we also know that evidence use is very context specific because it's a complex process driven by all manner of factors. And so I think if intermediate organizations are going to become better in future, we need to do more in researching, documenting what we are learning, but also publishing that, sharing those lessons, just so that whichever organizations are coming on board, whichever future interventions we are putting together are drawing on well-documented lessons, systematically documented lessons and experiences, so that we keep improving as far as evidence-informed decision-making is concerned. I'm not saying nothing is happening, something is happening, but it just seems to me like an area where we need to do more. And of course, the challenge there that not much is going on is because there is some funding for evidence intermediary organizations, but there isn't really often so much funding for studying and researching and understanding what works and what doesn't work. And so often a lot of us are drawing lessons from the interventions we are implementing, as opposed to saying that you'll design a very systematic research study and understand what's happening. So I think my one point there in terms of us getting better is really growing the field through research and publications to just get better understanding on what's already there, what tools are there, what tools are lacking, what are the gaps, but importantly, what are we learning in what context, and what does it mean for future intervention as far as evidence use is concerned. The other thing in terms of how the future looks like, or how better looks like, that I would like to mention here is the need for us as intermediary organizations to broaden the target of beneficiary organization that we work with. A lot of us, and that could be biased, but a lot of us have focused on governments, you know, as the users of evidence, which is critical. But it seems to me that there hasn't been as much focus at other groups that are important in using evidence. Here I'm thinking about parliaments, I'm thinking about media. Media does a lot of coverage, and improving how they cover their stories, drawing on data and evidence, is as critical as is promoting the use of evidence by governments. And so I'm thinking of these other important groups like media, parliaments, civil society organizations, how they draw on evidence in their advocacy, in their activism type of work. And I'm thinking about communities as well, because communities have this big role of holding their governments, even local governments, to account. How can they ensure they're using evidence more in all these efforts? So the need for us the future would be better if we also did as much focus on other uses of evidence as we have done on governments. The other point I would note in terms of looking at the future, I think that technology is evolving very fast, and social media has become so influential. It doesn't seem to me that as intermediate organizations, as far as evidence is concerned, we have harnessed the power of technology and social media in promoting and supporting evidence use. And so I think we need to go more into the harnessing some of the power of technology, but also the power of social media in promoting and enabling the use of evidence by a wide range of stakeholders, governments, parliaments, but also, the other groups I've just talked about. Another area that I think the future would be better for us is also perhaps shifting a bit from, shifting more into systemic, institutionalized types of interventions. So there is quite a lot of focus on providing evidence, disseminating evidence, but it seems to me that if we're going to nurture a culture of evidence use, then we'll need to move more into looking at what are the systemic factors underlying reasons why people are not using evidence as a norm, as a day-to-day thing. And so thinking more of interventions that will be strategic, which means they will be longer term, but they would also look at systemic barriers to evidence use, and then interventions that would speak to those types of systemic challenges. I know that is where the elephant is in the room, because that means there's need for more investments, for strengthening knowledge structures, for interventions that challenge the norms and how we make decisions. And so I think the need for a shift in looking at interventions that speak more to systemic barriers to evidence use is an important focus. There's of course some work going on at the moment. AFIDEP were involved a lot in looking at institutions and structures and systems for evidence use, but there is a lot more that needs to be done in that area. And for me, I think that's the kinds of interventions that would get us thinking of a culture of evidence use, where evidence is used as a norm, as opposed to where evidence is used, as something that happens once in a while. The other point that I'll speak to, perhaps moving away from how the future looks like, I think an important point on how the future would be better is collaborating more. So just for intermediate organizations to collaborate more, share lessons, share tools, so there isn't duplication and lack of coherence. And I think there, perhaps the point on collaboration is to think about why aren't evidence intermediary organizations collaborating more? Because there are obviously reasons why we are not doing more on collaboration. Some of them is just that people are very busy. People are very busy, but also there are issues around there aren't as many ready platforms for collaboration, particularly in the evidence-informed decision-making field. And I'm saying that because there are all manner of huge conferences in different subject areas, but we don't have as many in the EIDM field. And so the busyness of different players, but also the inadequate existing platforms or conferences for exchange. I think also lack of being deliberate. If you're not very deliberate to collaborate, then we are likely not to collaborate. And so being deliberate to collaborate. And I think the other thing is just funding for collaborative activities. Often we are funded to implement things like AFIDEP. We are funded to implement interventions with governments, with parliaments, with media. We don't really have funding to collaborate and foster collaboration with other actors. So the lack of funding there is also obviously a barrier. Now, what can be done? I think obviously then what can be done is looking at these reasons in terms of what are the incentives. When we collaborate, why are we collaborating? As AFIDEP, we have collaborated with other intermediary organizations in doing joint proposals. Like right now we have work with other intermediary organizations going on in Kenya. They're implementing in Uganda, some are implementing in Malawi. So through that joint grants, we're able to collaborate and work together more. We also, of course, collaborate through bilateral calls where we share lessons with various organizations that we know work in this area. And so we have a lot to learn from each other. But obviously we could do much more than what we are currently doing to collaborate and share lessons. The other thing that I touched on is, of course, weak collaboration means that there is a bit of lack of coherence in the interventions and a bit of duplication in this area. And so it seems to me that funding could, deliberate funding for collaboration would mean that there are probably better or more networks that facilitate exchange, and they're more structured in ensuring platforms for exchange like regular webinars or e-newsletters, or even annual conferences or social media platforms that facilitate different groups to share their lessons and tools for others to learn from. And so I think at the bottom of that, there's the issue of funding, but then of course, looking at that, there's the need for deliberate efforts like networks or communities of practice that would facilitate better collaboration and better sharing of ideas. I think the final thing I would speak to before I end is the issue of competition. Of course, there being so many of us, intermediate organizations, the issue of competition means that many of us are competing for specific, common resources, because much of this is coming from funded work. So many of us are competing for grants from very few organizations that are providing grants. In terms of how that could be better, how we could perhaps reduce the competition, I think funders, and there are not many funders though are funding this kind of work on evidence intermediary, but the few funders there could perhaps play a big role in ensuring a balance and a mix of, large funding grants that enable intermediate organizations to work together in consortia, and perhaps different ones lead different components based on their strengths and experience, but also have a mix of those large consortia type of grants, but also smaller grants where institutions can lead the kind of work that they have strength in a specific country, in a specific district, or a specific county. And so in terms of dealing with competition, I really think that funders, the few funders, supporting work in this area could play some big role. They could also even do better in facilitating their grantees to share lessons coming from, because a lot of funders will fund different evidence-informed interventions in different sectors, different countries. And so they hold some power there in ensuring that there are platforms for grantees to share lessons and to avoid duplication and lack of coherence in what they are funding. And I think finally, in terms of dealing with lack of coherence and duplication, I think as experts who work in this area, we also have a role in coming together to define some kind of manifesto, or I don't know what to call it, but some kind of document that would really give some sense of what has been done so far, what do we know, what don't we know, and what should the future look like? What should we be innovating with to learn more about things that we don't know? And also, what should we be measuring? And as I talk about measuring, I think this is an area where measuring evidence use efforts is not a very well developed area. And support and funding in that area could really help us in growing this field of promoting and supporting evidence use within governments and among a wider range of stakeholders. I will stop there and hand it back to you, Olivia, and I'll be happy to speak to any questions later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose, and what a provocative call for action for a manifesto. I absolutely love that idea, and evidence-driven, evidence-informed manifesto, speaking to your evaluation points, and the funding points are being picked up in the chat already. Please do continue to pose your questions to the panel in the chat. So thank you for that. Now over to you, Itzhak, for your provocations.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for joining, and thank you, Rose, for setting us up so well. I think one of the things I want to pick up in my comments is really this idea of cohesion or lack of cohesion. But let me start, one of the things that I was trying to push our community to do, selfishly maybe, is to think about evidence use or improving use of evidence as a behavior. And part of the reason is when we approach it as a behavior, we have really excellent tools to think through the problem that we're trying to solve, and also to address the problems we're trying to solve. So we have a lot of tools that are building on how we can promote behavior in a very large scale and support and sustain it over time. One of the things about that, in addition to bringing in theories and frameworks and measures and all kinds of really wonderful tools such as problem analysis and audience analysis, and messaging analysis and everything we just generally do. One of the things it does actually predict the future to some extent, right? And so the first thing that it does when you engage in this exercise is you set yourself some sort of an end goal. What is the end goal of this effort? And the end goal for many of us seems to be that we want the use of evidence, both in practice and policy, to be institutionalized in a sense that it shows up in policies and in funding and in norms in terms of culture, but also in terms of routines. So people have routines that are very established. One thing I'll point out quickly is that we very quickly can go down the path of talking about evidence use being an end. The goal is to use evidence no matter what, as opposed to thinking about how we use evidence as means for something. And so that's a separate conversation. But when we do this kind of behavioral analysis, the first thing we do is SWOT analysis. And SWOT analysis is looking at what are the strengths and weaknesses that we have internally, and what opportunities and threats we have right now that can impact our future. So I would suggest that if you look internally, we have tremendous amount of capacity already. We just need to, we have different programs, we have different models for promoting use of research evidence. What we need in terms of weaknesses is a bit more coherence and more synergy and coordination to leverage that capacity across issues and problems, across disciplines, across sectors, and across levels. I want to focus a little bit on the external environment, because I think it's really relevant to us. So there's certain opportunities there, both in the EU, for example, but also in the United States. I think about the Year of Evidence, where there's some sort of commitments from government to invest in a better evidence use to inform decisions, and government across units, across agencies, and so forth. So that's a very welcome opportunity. But we also need to be mindful of the threats that appear. One of them is that the authority of science is being undermined. In the United States, the Supreme Court now has more authority than any scientist, no matter what issue you are discussing right now. So courts are taking over what typically science is supposed to be in terms of providing evidence, and legal evidence becoming more important than maybe scientific evidence. We also have a problem of relevance. It's not clear to people who use research how research is relevant to their life. How's it solving issues like inflation and economic and racism and some other kinds of issue? This is not an easy connection for most people, and that's something we need to work on. There's also therefore an issue about the value. What is the value proposition of research? What is the value proposition of science? If science starts conflicting with other values like freedom and economy and so forth, we're running into some sort of friction points, and we may not position to succeed in this. And then finally, there's an element of technology. The world is moving. So if the future users of science are my children, I have 4 of them, 2 in college, 2 in middle school, who don't necessarily trust their father, who had 24 years of education and is an expert on things, but rather trust Siri with every question they have, then we need to become Siri for people who want to use that, because that's how they want to use it. So the Waze type of model, navigation model, is what people want. They want the information they need, when they need it, in the format they need it, and use it to inform decision as close as possible. So that's another challenge for us, because the technology presents both opportunity and challenge in terms of how it shapes audience preferences. So what can we do now to ensure a future? And I want to follow up on Rose and argue for greater coherence. So we need, and I want to make 3 points here. So we need greater coherence regarding the goals and value of evidence intermediaries. So we tend to focus a lot on knowledge transfer and knowledge translation. And I want to point out it's mostly one way, translation from science to users, but not the other way. And the other way is going to be very important, from practice to science, from people to science, from citizens to science. It's really going to be important to have build this relationship. We also need to think about, beyond that though, we need to think about this notion of adaptation. So for those what we call street level bureaucrats, these are who are not in government but in state government, was referred to them. These are people who make decisions at agencies, and mayors of towns. And so all of these people need that support. We cannot really focus only on people at the top. And what they need is the ability to take something from science and adapt it to the context and the setting of that's unique in order for that to work for them. But if we think about the goal as building relationship, not simply transferring knowledge, then we can think about what we can do in terms of what intermediaries can do in terms of dialogue, facilitating conversation between science and non-scientists, with media and politicians and other stakeholders, that reaches that compromise, that reaches that conversation about the value of science and how science stands in relation to other forms of knowledge, and other forms that are also legitimate forms of knowledge. I think intermediaries also have a very important role in terms of putting checks and balances on us as scientists, in terms of telling us that we miss issues of equity, that we're overlooking issues of representation, that some of our science can lead to unintended effects. And so we need somebody to check on us, because we don't have monopoly over knowledge and we don't know everything. And there's no guarantee that science is going to solve all problems, whatever we do. And I think that there's an element there that was referred to, this notion that there's a need to someone to facilitate this relationship and collaborations, to put us together in conversation with one another so we can leverage that capacity that we have. So we need greater coherence there. Second point I'm trying to make is that we need a better coherence about what are the intermediary roles and functions. So what do these intermediaries do? Okay, we think about them as a conduit or a bridge. But just before I jumped on this call about an hour ago, I just did a quick search for the word intermediaries, and here's the things that came up. So we have evidence intermediaries, so that's what we hear today. We have information intermediaries, and that include things like portals, such as the What Works clearinghouses. Then we also have data intermediaries. These are the folks who are supposed to make sure we collect the data that we need, and the people use the data to empower decisions, including this whole movement toward democratizing evidence. It's really important for a lot of us. And then we have diffusion intermediaries. These are people who can help with dissemination. And we have surveillance intermediaries, the Googles of the world and so forth, who do sensing and listening and tell us what kind of problems are there, what we need to address. And then we also have innovation intermediaries, and we have implementation intermediaries, and we have coordinating intermediaries. These are the conveners, the connectors, the enablers that move the things forward. We have advocacy intermediaries. That was the topic of the previous session. And then we also have those intermediaries that cut a deal, they're the brokering deals. And these are working in the policy regulation environment, trying to translate these into policies or regulations that we can use. So just look at the different definitions of intermediaries we have, and you can see why it's very difficult for us to say or to communicate in a plain way what intermediaries are. And so I suggest that we need to get more coherence, but these different kinds of roles, all of them are important. There's a tendency in our literature to suggest that brokers should do all of these. That unicorn does not exist. We need to think about division of labor here and how we cultivate this kind of partnership and structure when we can build that. We also need greater coherence in that sense in terms of how we align what intermediaries do with decision-making. And so one of the mechanisms we tend to emphasize here is the idea of learning, that people learn from evidence, both in the policy and practice. But that's not the only way in which intermediaries are using evidence. They're using evidence for persuasion. They're using evidence for pressure. They're using evidence for negotiation. They're using evidence for nudging. And it's also important for them to understand, to use research evidence in proximity to decision-making. So in terms of both the timing, when is the right timing to introduce evidence, and what are the opportunities, what are the tables in which decisions are being made where intermediaries need to be in order to make sure that research evidence at least is being considered when it goes. So it's not enough to say what intermediaries do. We need to align that more clearly with all these other issues that we're talking about. Now, where does it leave us? And so that's my thoughts. So what I practice in my behavior work, and so in my assessment, use of research evidence is not anything like vaccine hesitancy. We don't have people who strongly oppose evidence. People are using evidence. We are in the realm of managing chronic disease. So in the same way we want people to manage obesity, and we provide evidence to support obesity, we want to make sure that this is becoming a routine. So we want to change a habit and move into that assessment. I think that's a most comparable behavior for me in terms of use of research evidence. So we use something called social marketing, and social marketing recognizes that knowledge alone is not going to motivate people to do anything. Just knowing that research evidence exists does not mean people are using it. So how do we move it beyond that? How do we move beyond this education piece? We talk about strategic partnership. And one of the questions we need to answer here is that what are intermediaries getting out of this? The social marketer asks, what am I getting out of this? So we know what we're getting out of this in terms of introducing research evidence, but what are the intermediary organizations getting out of it? And I think that's really important to answer that question in terms of how they're becoming as partners as opposed to, again, conduit or a bridge that we use. Social marketing also told you need to think about beyond promotion, which is what we think about. You need to think about other elements. One of them is, what is the product you're selling? What is the value of science? What is the value? And how do we make it easier to access that knowledge? And so you have the core product, which is presumably knowledge, understanding, and then you have the augmented products, the tools that we produce, things like dashboards and some other things that can make it easier for people to use research. It's not that they're opposed to use research, just want to use it. And then when we think about the price of using research, what is the cost of using that? How do we reduce that price? And then we get to promotion. So we need to think about the product, the price, and the place. That's called the marketing mix, in addition to promotion. And we need to move into the marketing domain. So we can use a little bit of marketing push to start moving into the future. And then I want to suggest that we need to improve the user experience. So, we are thrilled to run regression models every single day, but it may shock you that most people don't. And so while we cannot expect other people to do what we want to do or to follow the processes we do, so we need to find some sort of a way. So one of the things that social marketers talk about is how do we take a behavior that no one wants to do, and how do we make it fun, easy, and popular? Okay, and that came out in a discussion we had yesterday around the same issue about cancer communication, and people walk in the field just say, you just need to make it more fun. There's all kinds of way of using art and some other forms. So how do we make science or use of research evidence fun, easy, and popular? Thank you.
Thank you so much. You covered a lot of ground, but I love the ending on fun. I think we don't have enough of that for sure. So that's really great and really interesting to pick up, back up on your points around equity and representation, but also the kind of, as you outlined, the list of intermediary types and how actually intermediaries within intermediary organizations are often expected to be able to cover huge swathes of ground. And what does that actually mean, therefore, for the status of those roles, because it's actually very hard to find data, information, implementation, brokering, etc. in one person. So maybe we can kind of get back in the chat about career pathways and structures within evidence intermediary organizations and the types that we might like to see recognized. I'm delighted to pass over to our final speaker, John Lavis, who's joined us. So John, over to you, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Great. Thanks very much, Olivia. Good to meet you. Can you reassure me that you can see my slides?
Yeah, I can see your slides.
Great. And good to meet Itzhak as well. And Rose, good to see you. I haven't seen you in person in a few years. I just put up a few slides by way of context, and then I always take requests very literally. So Jonathan Brecken suggested a number of questions I should try and answer, which I will. So the better future. So myself and a number of colleagues are very focused on formalizing and strengthening the evidence support system. And I've come to realize how helpful it is to think about it as distinct, even if it overlaps at times with the research system, where many of us have our day jobs, those of us who are in the academic world, and separately again from the innovation system. For me and a number of my colleagues, an evidence support system is grounded in an understanding of a national or a state or provincial context. It's demand-driven, and it's focused on contextualizing the evidence for a given decision in an equity-sensitive way. So I'm not sure which of the list from Itzhak this conception would match to, maybe the coordination intermediary. And I think of it as being the evidence intermediaries as having to be nested within this evidence support system, and they are either helping to build it or they are leveraging what is already happening within that evidence support system. So my focus is more on the system within which the intermediaries are located, but I see them as critically important players. Some of the examples of the infrastructure that they would either create or work alongside are evidence support units that combine the power of national evidence in all its forms. I'm going to talk about 5. Itzhak mentioned a number of them, and the power of global evidence. But it's also expert panels that we've seen so much of during COVID-19, but the future needs to be expert panels that have people with methods expertise and people with lived experience sitting at the table. And those people need to be supported with pre-circulated evidence summaries and encouraged to be explicit about how their recommendations are based on both evidence and what Itzhak rightly singled out, experiences. But we also need to flip these processes on their heads and look at citizen and stakeholder engagement processes that provide ways in for evidence. And for me, part of where we can help also is helping government science advisors speak in a way that make it possible to judge their accuracy. And sadly, we didn't see as much of this during COVID-19 as would have been ideal. And then we need many processes in place, processes to elicit and prioritize evidence needs, find and package evidence that meets these needs and set time constraints, strengthens capacity for evidence use. But the thing that we're most preoccupied right now is finding ways to incorporate evidence use into routine processes, submissions to cabinet, budget proposals, spending plans. So this conception starts with the demand side and then asks how we mobilize the evidence supply side to make a difference. Some of the things that the evidence intermediaries working in that type of system need to be able to do is match the evidence to the step in the decision-making process. And unfortunately, many evidence intermediaries are focused on single forms of evidence. They bring just data analytics. They bring just behavioral and implementation research. And there is a role, as Itzhak mentioned, for all of them. But we also need evidence intermediaries that can pick and choose the forms of evidence to respond to a question that comes from the demand side. So this we see as being one of the critical functions of evidence intermediaries. Another critical function of evidence intermediaries is that they combine the power of national evidence or local evidence. What have I learned in my country or my province or state or my local community with the power of global evidence? So what has been learned from around the world? And how does it vary by groups and contexts? Because my group, my context may be similar or different, and local applicability of the evidence is very important. So you'll see those 5 forms of evidence that we think of as being particularly key, and the typical form in which evidence is encountered by decision makers, as opposed to how we may choose to label it in the academy, then the global evidence, and sometimes they're brought together in the form of recommendation containing documents. One of the big breakthroughs with COVID-19 was the incredible explosion of living evidence syntheses that slot new evidence in as often as every week into a document that evolves as the context evolves and as the evidence evolves. And the new normal will be all of us who function as evidence intermediaries adjusting to a world where we can turn to these living evidence products. And then a final thing that I'll say about evidence intermediaries is they need to have a very big toolkit. And you'll see some of the strategies here, co-production near and dear to the heart of many people on this call, bringing not just the researchers, but diverse affected communities to the table to co-produce new national evidence in all of its forms, to co-produce syntheses. We worked with a pool of 20 citizens who would put their hand up to contribute to syntheses in hours and days. Timely, demand-driven, contextualized, equity-focused evidence products. Some during COVID-19 we produce in timelines as short as 4 hours, more commonly 1 to 3 days. Evidence intermediaries ideally either maintain or use one-stop evidence shops where evidence products like evidence syntheses have been rated for quality, and use a range of engagement mechanisms to put the evidence alongside all of the other factors that we know are going to drive decision-making. So now to Jonathan's question, first one about how can we collaborate? I'm just going to try and get rid of this message. How can we collaborate to build a better future? And specifically, he asked, is there more we can do to collaborate? What can we realistically do? And so my answer here is there are mechanisms in place to support collaboration across countries, sometimes with a sectoral focus. So I'm very involved in a VIPNet that brings together evidence intermediaries from 55 countries focused on health. There are mechanisms to bring evidence intermediaries together across sectors with a national focus, the What Works network in the UK, but also with a regional focus like the Africa Evidence Network. I think the next logical step for these existing collaborative enterprises is to try to better document and support the adaptation of their lessons learned. So more of us benefit from the insights that come from them sharing their experiences across countries, countries and across sectors. Jonathan's next question was, how do we manage competition and lack of coherence? And here I found myself thinking, well, coherence comes from focusing on a system. If we focus on our own organizations, we will not get where we need to be. We need to, as evidence intermediaries, be working with others to co-develop a system where our role in it will emerge over time. But if we go in with the preconceived notion that we have to be in charge or our view has to triumph, we will not get to a high-functioning evidence support system. Eventually, as that system evolves over time, there will inevitably be competition. But to me, that's not such a bad thing. If the so-called buyers, policymakers, others can judge quality, not just price and volume. And this is starting to get easier for evidence products, if not yet for evidence processes. We've spent, since we released the Evidence Commission report back in January, a lot of time talking to people in many countries about how we strengthen evidence support systems. And to me, the biggest roadblocks are those who are threatened by efforts on the decision-making side to move away from the current ad hoc evidence use and ad hoc processes as in the big meaty issue space, as opposed to what for me is the easier question of which products or which programs and services, easier to routinize the process, easier to standardize the evidence use. But the other group that is very threatened by this way of thinking are the folks that are advantaged by the the current system. But many of those people are researchers who will still be rock stars in the research system and can play a very critical role in the evidence support system if they're supported to help interpret what the evidence means for a given jurisdiction, not just to present their own research. And then Jonathan's last question was, how can we, what should be the future priorities for evidence intermediary organizations? And here it happens that three very different groups across the globe have come to agreement from their own manifestos. Cochrane convenes, the EVIPNet call for action, and us with the Evidence Commission about three buckets of priorities. And the one that I focused on today, formalize and strengthen the evidence support system that they're part of. And we think that's best started with the rapid jurisdictional assessment. And we're currently watching 20 countries put these in place. I agree very much with Rose's comment about focusing on citizens as well. And you'll see that's the third area of focus. But today I just focused on the first one. So I'll stop there, Olivia, and turn it back to you.
I'm going to show my ignorance, and I don't know what a rapid jurisdictional assessment is, so maybe we can get into that, John, in the chat. But thank you so much to yourself and our three speakers. We now have time to cover off questions, so please do add your questions in the chat. But while people are still thinking, I shall take chair's privilege. So I suppose I was struck by all three speakers who you've all sort of made the points about sort of learning, sharing resources, coming together, working in partnership, and also the role that citizens have to play in sort of, you know, future systems and the system that we kind of want to see. And I really like the kind of presentation of, you know, evidence and experience both counting. And I think in some senses that gets to the heart of the rub of the sort of qualitative versus quantitative arguments, and when both can count as evidence. But I suppose laying ourselves bare, laying our kind of wares out there can be quite daunting. And actually I think more evaluation is going on than what is being shared. So I'd be interested sort of in the panel's comments about, like, how can we kind of encourage a safe space to share what works and what doesn't, and to kind of learn those lessons so that we're not reinventing the wheel, we're creating a system we want to see, but that we're also potentially not being sort of blocked or thought, this failure rate is too high, or because we have a more mature system, let's say in the sort of university business relations or in other parts of the system. So I'd be really interested in sort of how we can do that well. So that's open to all three, actually, because you've all made comments to that effect. So Rose, maybe you would like to go first.
Thanks, Olivia. I like your point on the fact that more evaluation is being done, but it's not being shared. And perhaps the reasons why it's not being shared is I don't know, it might have something to do with one of them may be, I think, funding focus on impact and outcomes. And so if you're given funds for 2 or 3 years and there's a big focus on impact, or you changing things or changing a policy or structures, then there can be a feeling of, not sharing what, the challenges you're facing. So I think the need for us to focus more on learning, because it's obviously a field where we are still, if I may use a word that I think some of the scholars have used, are still muddling through in some way, particularly in some contexts, contexts where systems and structures remain weak or keep changing or shifting, So today you have a department of research, say in the Ministry of Health, tomorrow you don't. It's been dissolved into something else, it's been scrapped. So in contexts like those, you kind of feel you're still muddling through, because the systems are there, but sometimes they also keep changing and shifting. And so I think there's an importance there for us to focus on learning as opposed to impact. And maybe that's a message maybe for funders. As AFIDEP, we've been lucky because some of the funding we've received, particularly co-funding, has been from foundations that challenge us to focus on learning and be very honest about what's not working and what's working and what can we stop doing. And so some of the conversations we've had with some of our funders are really about, can you reflect more if this is working? If this is not working, we stop doing it, or we do something else, or we change how we are working. So I think having that kind of relationship with funders means that you feel safe to say some things that, other groups may not be willing to say because of the issue of trying to demonstrate impact. But again, when I talk about impact, I think we also need to understand impact on evidence, for evidence use at the different levels. I think there's been so much of a focus on, change policy, change structures, or, but there has to be a better understanding of what impact means in these kinds of work. It has to be a progressive, it's an incremental process. Change sometimes happens very quickly, as we have seen with COVID, but sometimes change takes forever, given the political and complexity of the space. And so having a better understanding of impact also means that we feel safer to say, with this particular initiative, we have only managed to change, say, the policymakers or the parliamentarians' way of thinking about this issue, but we haven't really convinced them to bring in a bill or a new law. And so understanding the different levels of impact means that we feel better to say that. So I think there's the issue of impact, there's the issue of understanding impact better and how it looks like at the different levels, because it's an incremental process, but also the issue of funding or funders, having a better understanding of this space and the fact that sometimes the impact a funder is asking for is not the type of impact you should be asking for in 2 or 3 years. And that's why some grantees may feel unsafe to talk about the failures, because there were all these big things that were being said when this grant was given. So hopefully I've spoken to it a bit, but it's obviously a big issue that we need to deal with in this area. Thank you.
No, you absolutely have Rose. Itzhak, I wondered if you wanted to stick on the same question, or we can see that Jonathan has also posed, we've spoken a lot about funders, but, what kind of could they do to help? So either how do we create a safe space to express failure, and also what more could funders do to help?
So I want to pick up on what Boaz was saying and bring up this issue of there's a cost to doing this kind of work. So a lot of the intermediaries I work with are very concerned about impact, because if they do something that does not work, they're risking not getting funding and continuing that. So you can see why they might not be motivated to share failure. And I think then we need to make it safer. So there's two ways in which we can do that. I think one, which is happening already, thanks to Annette and Catherine and Angela and so forth, is creating community of practice. A community of practice where we're coming to this as a professionals. We're trying to understand, we're trying to improve, and we're trying to get both the successes and failures and learn from that, because that's what we do. That's safe. And I think that's an environment. I think the issue of funder is very important. I think part of that is because of us, is because we tend to really think about how we're scaling up things and how we generalize. And it's very difficult to generalize interventions or scale up interventions that are based on behavioral or social science kind of methodologies. What we need to focus on instead is just suggest that it's not the end outcome that we can guarantee. What we're focusing on, as John suggested, focusing on the system and on the process. What is the process of doing this work? What are kind of the process level impact we're going to have? So one of them will be, for example, building capacity in organizations, building capacity in government, building capacity in local bureaucracy to use research evidence and at least acquire research evidence and so forth. That's good enough. We cannot guarantee that we'll actually use the evidence. And so focusing on this kind of process level outcomes as opposed to the end outcomes, I think will take away much of that pressure to produce things that we oftentimes don't have any control over, because we're not politicians and we're not doing this. And I think that changing the narrative in terms of what funders should be focusing on in terms of outcomes. And then the second thing will be the communities of practice, which is really, really important.
Thank you, that's great. And I think also changing the narrative will help funders themselves, because they are also under pressures to justify their own budget. So I suppose we shouldn't forget that they sit outside of this system as well. John, over to you.
I very much agree with the learning from peers. I wish I had the funders that Rose may have at times that are open to hearing from failures. Ours get very nervous very fast, and my employer, university, also does, because the work we do is so non-traditional from the perspective of the university. So the safe spaces for me have always been with peers, and I think the big learning for me from the last couple of years has been the power of learning from people working in other sectors, dealing with other forms of evidence, dealing with different political and other systems, whether they be health or education or whatever it is. And there's so many parallels, but then also so many unique ways that you operationalize things in a particular context. And you would think that safe spaces with peers who might be competitors wouldn't work. But my experience is that what you hear about in these fora, you can hear about what's done and how it's done, but a lot of this work takes a long time to learn how to do it well in a particular context. And it takes often years to build the relationships, build the experience with the systems analysis, the political analysis, and other things. So even if I'm sitting there with a so-called competitor, they can often tell me they're doing things, and I would think, it would take us 3 years to get there, which doesn't mean we won't do it. But there's typically, I don't feel a risk that just being very honest about everything that's working well and working poorly is somehow going to disadvantage us. So I think learning from peers, whether you call that communities of practice or something else, is just incredibly important. But what we need to do is try to better summarize what we're learning and share it with other people, so not just the privileged few who get invited into those rooms can benefit from those insights.
Yeah, that's great. We've got a question from Raj Patel, which is, I'll do my best to read it out. At a systems level, one can have organizations that focus on business to business relations or business to consumer, in brackets, public relations. But isn't it difficult to combine both types of functions within the same intermediary? I'm going to go back to Itzhak, who spoke about systems, and then we'll come to John and then Rose, if that's okay.
So Hopefully you guys can hear me. Okay, so one of the things, I want to push this idea of strategic partnerships. So when you talk about strategic partnerships, you're not talking about people who are necessarily share the same mission. So think about intermediary organizations. Some of the organizations I work with in my routine has an advocacy mission. Their job is to advocate effectively for patients and make sure that evidence is being used to inform policies. Others are more concerned about service delivery. So there's different kinds of mission to different organizations. And the idea of strategic partnership is not to duplicate or replicate the strength, but really building on things that you don't have. And so some of the what organizations do in this space, just corporate organizations, well, to figure out that the role of the intermediary is not only simply connecting them to public. So corporate social responsibility will be an example, connecting, corporations to social causes or citizens and benefiting that. And that might be one function of the organization, but it will be another function that look actively at, we have a supply chain issue. So who can I partner with who can solve my problem right now? And I think that's a kind of thinking we need to bring to partnership in this. We do not need to have several academic institutions collaborating or entering a coalition. We need to work with different kinds of brokers, or different kind of intermediaries. And again, the question will be, I want to go back to, and that's a message to funders as well, which is you paying the academics here, but the intermediaries need to be paid too. They're not just simply doing a labor of love. And so there's some sort of a change in the mechanism to allow for organization to get resources they need to improve and so forth. But I do want to push this idea of strategic, as opposed to we all becoming one echo chamber, and we just talk to ourselves and vent about how successful we are.
Great, thank you. Rose, did you want to pick up this question?
No, I'll let John go. I think I'm still just happy to smiling at what the colleague just said. So let John go for now.
Me too. So over to you, John.
I do think there's some truth in the fact that, it's hard to be an expert in supporting evidence use among government policymakers, separately among organizational leaders, separately from professionals, nurses, teachers, social workers, others, and separately again for citizens. So there is, some expertise that builds up over time, no question. But I guess the evolution that we've been going through, our focus for now many, many years has been supporting government policymakers. Then we started to bring everyday citizens into the process to try to capture their experiences and the values they think need to be put on the table alongside the evidence. And then through the Evidence Commission, because of some very articulate, forceful, savvy citizen leaders, we have a recommendation about the importance of putting evidence at the center of everyday life. And that is now starting to take us into all kinds of domains that are very new for us. Artificial intelligence driven algorithms on a variety of different platforms, all kinds of places where citizens currently go. So, but it's a very steep learning curve, and I will never catch up to people who have spent their career focused on that. But we see it as so powerfully complementary, because at the end of the day, government policymakers are driven by voters. And if we over time are putting evidence at the center of everyday life, more and more societal pressure will be brought to bear on politicians, and it won't just be citizens benefiting directly in terms of more informed decisions themselves. But no question, expertise builds up. These different target audiences are very different drivers of decision making, and it's hard to just jump from one to the other unless you have incredibly well-connected partners who really know that space very, very well.
Thank you. So possibly as part of Rose's manifesto, we've got the kind of focus on the end users and helping them to be savvy interrogators of the evidence coming their way. Perhaps that's a call in the manifesto. We've got another question which sort of from Paul Grimshaw, which sort of essentially boils down to, does geography matter? You know, is there an ideal location for intermediaries, and in brackets, pros and cons of sort of being in a university setting versus, you know, being located somewhere else. Rose, I'd be interested if you have thoughts directly on that question.
I won't speak to pros and cons, but some of the arguments I've made strongly over the past couple of years is the need for universities as well to be deliberate in setting up departments or units that strengthen their think tank role. And that then would be the intermediary type of organization. I don't think that there are many, well, I'm talking more of the universities that I know, mainly in Kenya, but also in some parts of Africa. You find that there aren't many intermediate organizations in this, or departments or units or centers within these universities. And so I think I can't speak to the cons and pros, but I think that that would be a good place for this to be. I know that some other intermediate organizations are also set within government types of settings, which also gives them a lot of opportunity to engage and be involved on a day-to-day basis, because they're sitting in spaces where often decisions are being made routinely. And so they can engage and create the relationships needed internally to bring about profound change as far as evidence use is concerned. And so I think there are pros and cons of being located in whatever, but I think being clear on some of the principles, particularly the principles that we talked about here of relations or focusing on the system, then it means that perhaps it might be, regardless of where you are set up, that you bring in different strengths, whether you're set in a university or whether you're set within a government setting. After we are set outside of any of this, we are not set in a government or a university. And also that gives us various strengths to engage and bring these two groups that are often apart together. Thanks.
Thanks, Rose. In the sort of UK context, there's definitely an explosion of I suppose, intermediary organisations within the university sector, of which I lead one at UCL, and we actually spend quite a lot of our time sort of talking less about, I suppose, proximity, but how do we mobilise knowledge across different jurisdictions and geographies, and what are the types of partnerships that are needed when you are a sort of big research intensive dominant Russell Group university, and actually you have sort of research and evidence that can help in inverted commas a left behind place. You know, is that the kind of debates you should be intervening in, and what's therefore then the role of other types of intermediaries within that, when the power imbalance and other issues kind of come into play. Itzhak, I can see you nodding. I don't know if you want to pick up any of those points.
So I might be ideological here, and so I feel very strongly that the translation side of thing is the role of universities. We have obligation to take research and translate that to different audiences. We have the capacity to do this. You know, we have processes in place. We just need to change incentives in terms of tenures and some other things in terms of producing that. And I think that also can be a role for funders, who can insist that whatever research we produce would be translated. And so there's already, you know, a lot of CTSA that's a Center for Clinical Translation. There's many mechanisms already to support this kind of work, and they are expanding. So I really feel that that is the kind of domain that a university should take the lead on. Here's what we're not really good at. We're really not good at listening. We're terrible at listening because we're not trained to do this. And we always come to save people as opposed to listening to what they want and also finding out what they found out to be useful. So I feel intermediary organization is a very important for the listening part of that. I also believe that they're very important for adaptation. So taking that information from science and putting that in the context of implementation, that's a different ballgame. You know, whatever works in a laboratory almost never works outside the laboratory. And so bringing their expertise, these marketing things and so forth. So think about, you know, who's good listeners, for example. Politicians actually are good listeners, so are journalists, and so are community organizations. And so we need to empower them rather than try to train them to do stuff they don't want to do, which is to translate research and build the capacity. Why don't we find the strength that they have and leverage that? So I really strongly believe in this division of labor that can move up beyond this issue.
Thank you. I'm loving the conversation about labor, so rarely acknowledged and often goes hidden in this type of work. So it's great to see it so front and center in this discussion. John, I'm going to direct this question to you, if that's okay. It's from Laura Miha, and she's interested to know, how do intermediary organizations enable, facilitate, recognize those individuals who act as knowledge intermediaries, even when they don't necessarily adopt the term?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're somebody we're based in an academic organization, and so we're subject to the usual focus on peer-reviewed grants and peer-reviewed publications. So we still need to adhere to those metrics, but we're seeing more and more, not yet mine, but we're seeing more and more academic environments figure out how to value contributions to the evidence support system. As Rose alluded to before, my view at least is we shouldn't be held accountable for impacts. Most of us have the good fortune to live in democracies where elected leaders have to make tough decisions on our collective behalf, but we can be held accountable for robust contributions to evidence and experiences being explicitly considered in those types of decision-making environments. So I think we need to get better at those metrics for contributions to the evidence support system. And just on the previous question, if I could, as you could hopefully tell from what I was saying, I'm very focused on demand-driven, and I'm a little bit skeptical about lots of this stuff being driven from the research supply side. So there are so many reasons why a lot of evidence intermediary roles need to happen in government. They have to happen in central agencies like Cabinet Office, like Treasury Board, like Ministries of Finance. They need to happen in science and technology ministries that may set parameters for science advisors and expert panels. They need to happen in line ministries where that rich institutional knowledge of what's in scope, what's not out of scope, what's the jurisdictional discretion available to the minister, that kind of stuff. All of that stuff is absolutely key. And so we need robust evidence intermediaries in government. And then where there are gaps, they can be filled by those, whether in universities or independent from outside. But then, as Itzhak was alluding to, there are lots of ways that the academy, where the academy can be at the forefront. It can be developing new methods. It can be building capacity. It can be doing a number of things. Where I get worried is where the academy perceives its role as promoting its own research, as opposed to responding to demands for the many forms of evidence that may be needed for decision making. And my final comment, just briefly, there was a question about Latin American networks. The VIPNet network that I mentioned before, albeit focused on health, has a regional entity, a VIPNet Americas. And then there's other entities. Brazil has a very vibrant community in its own right. So there are often networks that are region specific. For Africa, I mentioned the Africa Evidence Network. Rose is at the center of an ecosystem on her continent as well. So there are often these very powerful regional groups, and Rose and others may want to speak to their importance.
An open invitation from John. Thanks for that. Rose, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I am involved in the Continental Network on Africa Evidence Network, and I think it's played a big role in even just raising the value and awareness around evidence and evidence-informed decision-making. And the value of that network is that it cuts across sectors. So it doesn't have a specific sector, which means that whether you're working in transport and roads and engineering, whether you're working in health, you are, eligible to join that network and share lessons and learn. And they have annual conferences I think they're biannual conferences, but they also have awards of excellence that interest a lot of people who are innovating with evidence use. And so I think they've played a big role in getting a wider range of researchers talking about evidence-informed decision-making beyond those in health and if often in planning who are, the common groups talking about this, but also getting people in government agencies and in parliaments. I've been in some of those conferences and you find colleagues who work in parliament also being in those conferences. I think it's a very, very critical platform. In terms of moving into the future, I think there is more to deepen that a bit more into sub-regional and country level chapters, maybe, I should call them chapters, that then feed into that continental network, because it's huge. But I think at country level, there's a lot that can be done in different countries in terms of sharing lessons, tools that different groups are using. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Itzhak, did you want to come in on that question?
Just to emphasize the thing, that's the notion of place, is we tend to focus a lot on national level. And sometimes we cannot, at least in the United States, it's very difficult to get traction with this. We find more receptive audiences in state level and local levels who really need to make pragmatic decisions about things. And they're looking for that, what we call instrumental use of evidence, as opposed to conceptual use of evidence. They're not looking to make political use of evidence. They're looking to make that. So sometimes we need to choose where we want to be and make ourselves available. And being localized, I think that's one way of also ending up building that demand that John, right on the point. It's an incredibly important point, building that demand, kind of from the bottom up, because then you can see how evidence is really being useful and how it's being normatively used in a way that politicians and national level can take a look at.
Great, thank you. We're definitely beginning to see a turn, I suppose, to the local and regional in the UK, certainly, and thinking about, I suppose, the entry points into how you do that, especially sort of being situated in London with, numerous boroughs, regional policy making. It's a complex system in itself. So trying to sort of figure out the nodal networks can take some time. We've got time, I think, for one last question, which actually goes back to you, John, from Jonathan himself. And he's written that you mentioned sort of 3 convening bodies, but do we need some more mergers in the future? And he goes on to kind of say that, the demand side may not want a plethora of confusing amount of bodies. So are we sort of looking at sort of collapsing, doing the strategic partnerships that Itzhak mentioned? And if so, what might they look like, and what might the ingredients be that we need?
And I'm wondering, Jonathan, did you mean, when you said 3, what popped into my head were a VIPNet, Africa Evidence Network, and the What Works Council, but did you mean exclusively at the national level?
It could be at any level.
At any level, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I do think that it's inevitable that people, ask very tough questions when they see this type of work. And to Olivia's point with my shameful use of jargon, rapid jurisdictional assessment, what I meant by that was a rapid assessment of the many existing evidence support mechanisms that are in place, whether that be at the state or local level or the national level. And so with the example of our Canadian federal government, it's looking at all of those parts of government, all of their partnerships with outside groups within academia and broader, and if they have them, connections to UN system entities, OECD, and other groups that they turn to for evidence support, and asking, what are these groups doing? And do we have too many happening on data analytics and 0 happening on behavioral and implementation research? Do we have only a focus on national and subnational evidence and 0 focus on global evidence? And then pointing to the gaps. So the messaging that we're trying to use in countries where we're working with partners or doing this ourselves is celebrate your successes, and if they're not already systematized and scaled up, then focus on that. Fill the gaps. Over time, there will be inevitably a third message about reduce redundancies in the system, but it feels like a very fragile time, and it also feels like a critical juncture. I feel like we really need to push in 2022 with all of the lessons from the last 27 months. I've learned more in those 27 months than I'd learned in the previous 23 years being active in this space. So let's push now, keep the framing positive, build on what's going well, fill the gaps, and those difficult conversations will inevitably come, the tough ones around redundancies, duplication, overlap, and I'm sure, you know, that will happen. But for now, we're trying to keep the messaging positive to try to build as broad-based a coalition in these different countries to really move forward now as we possibly can.
I think that's a fantastic message to end on, and a really positive call and kind of rally for us to think about the narratives that we are kind of sharing amongst ourselves, sharing within the networks that we're sort of in, and sort of to truly think about we're actually part of the system and we have the power to create what it is that we want to see. So I'm really delighted to have had the opportunity to be part of this brilliant conversation. So thank you to all three speakers for making it so utterly fascinating. It's over to Annette now, just to kind of wrap up and I think sort of talk about next steps with where the recordings and so on and so forth will be hosted. So over to you, Annette.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And thank you to Rose, John, and for Itzhak for some really fantastic, stimulating thoughts there. My head's buzzing. So over the course of these 3 sessions, we've seen some really striking parallels. We've seen them across geographical areas, we've seen them across topic areas, and we've seen them in terms of activities, skills, values, work, opportunities, challenges. So a big thank you to our contributors for all the time they've put into thinking about those connections and thinking about how the different work they're doing does link, and making those efforts to speak across some of these boundaries. And I think that rallying cry we've heard today and at our first session to think about how we make this work more fun for everyone is a take-home message for us all. So there's definitely much more for us to share, maybe in more similar forums like this, maybe in some smaller closed door sessions. One of the sort of things that came out of the previous session was, is there more kind of nuanced, smaller scale discussions we might want to have about some of these political elements of advocacy, for example. But in terms of what's next, so we've got some great blogs coming out from contributors at the various sessions. We're also going to be posting the recordings of all the sessions for people who weren't able to attend. So please point people in the direction of those if you think they'd be interested. We're also planning to host a further set of events in the autumn and winter. So if you'd like to be involved, or you've got ideas of things you'd like, your kind of own burning topics you'd like to have considered, please get in touch and let us know. And we've also got some other ideas for things we think might be interesting to do, but again, it'd be interesting to hear from people. One of the things we're thinking of is maybe launching a journal club online, so we can get together and discuss papers we're interested in across different sectors and geographies. So if you've got a paper you'd like to suggest or present or discuss, then again, please get in touch. And last but definitely not least, there's the convening that we're engaged in with the Pew Charitable Trust and the William T. Grant Foundation. So that international meeting will be happening later on in the year to help us really move this debate forward by actually having an opportunity to get together in person. So thank you so much to everyone, to Saul for his work behind the scenes, to Jonathan for setting up the sessions. And I guess just Catherine might have a second to say a big thank you too. If Clem doesn't get in first.
Thank you from me to everybody. It's been fascinating. I'm a little incapacitated, but I've been enjoying it. I'm only sorry I couldn't capture more points, but very much looking forward to more discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.